this video so we can send it out to RSVPs along with some resources after the program. So moving forward, I'll just give a little background about the Berkshire Natural Resources Council. For any of you who might be new to the organization, BNRC is a land trust actively working throughout Berkshire County on land conservation, land stewardship, and community engagement. BNRC has helped to conserve a little over 22,000 acres in the Berkshires and offers 60 miles of trails, all free and open to the public. For more information, you can visit bnrc.org. And then now I'm going to pass it over super quickly to my coworker, Rich, before introducing our speaker.
Thanks, Mariah. Hello, everyone. My name is Rich Montone. I'm Director of Fundraising at Berkshire Natural Resources Council. Thanks for being here tonight. I just wanted to let you all know that BNRC is donor funded. I know that many of you are donors, so thank you for doing that. I'm going to put the link to donate to BNRC in the chat, which you can use tonight or not. This is not a fundraising event. This is a free event. But this event and all of BNRC's programming and all of the reserves and all of the trails and everything that BNRC does is made possible by donors who have decided that conservation and access to the outdoors in the Berkshires is important, and they have decided to make it so. So thanks for being here tonight and enjoy the program, and thanks for all your support.
Great, thanks so much, Rich. Let's see here. So now, please join me in welcoming Dave Wattles, the black bear and fur bearer biologist at MassWildlife. Dave has a master's and PhD from UMass, which led to studying moose ecology in Massachusetts using GPS collars. He started working with MassWildlife on bear research after the field portion of his moose research wrapped up. And at that time, MassWildlife was beginning to put GPS collars on bears. Previously, the state had been tracking with more conventional radio collars. And that eventually led Dave to becoming the state bear and fur bearer biologist 5 years ago. So thanks so much for being here, Dave. And we're all very much looking forward to this presentation.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me. Can everyone see the slides again? Just want to make sure that's up and good to go. So as Mariah said, okay, very good. So as Mariah said, I'm the state black bear and fur bearer biologist. So obviously the black bears is pretty self-explanatory. The fur bearers are species like coyote, bobcat, fisher, all of our carnivore species, plus beaver and muskrat. So I'm the lead state biologist for those species. I'm going to talk about some basic natural history of bears, then the research that we're doing on bears to learn more about their populations in mass, how they're using the landscape, their survival, their cub production. And those are the pieces of information we use to make the management decisions about the bear population. And then at the end, talk about what you can do to help to mitigate black bear conflict. One of the huge components of managing species like black bears and coyotes is trying to find ways for them to coexist with the public. And we very much need the public's help in order to achieve those goals. So right about now is when cubs are born. So a couple of weeks ago, we're starting some of our den work now of our collared animals. And I was walking in and locating dens on January 16th. I walked in on a den of a female that we knew was going to have newborn cubs, and I could hear cubs squalling in the den. Those cubs were probably only a couple of days old. So in mid-January is when they tend to give birth. Mom will stay in the den now with the cubs, and they will slowly get bigger at basically just surviving off of the milk she can provide until they leave the den around April 1st. From then on, she's basically going to show those cubs how to move around the landscape, what habitats to use. Did someone start sharing their screen? All right,
I just took it off, Dave.
Okay.
You can go back in and start your share again, and I'm going to take care of that.
Okay, very good. And so basically for the rest of the year, mom is showing them how, around her territory, where to find foods, what things are edible, and how to stay out of trouble and live in Massachusetts. They'll den with her again next winter as 1-year-old bears, and then it's the following April, May timeframe before the mating season when they're going to disperse and be on their own for the rest of their lives. So they disperse before the breeding season begins, which peaks in June. We've seen bears at our trap sites breeding as early as late April, but it really peaks in June and will taper off into July. This is a time of year where we tend to experience a lot of conflict with bears as well. All those young animals that are on their own for the first time tend to get into a lot of trouble. And also just the high levels of activity where males are moving all over the place during the mating season. We tend to get a lot of calls about bears at this time of year. When those cubs disperse, the females are going to typically use a portion of their mother's range. This is an advantage for them because mom has already showed them where to find food throughout the year. So that increases their chance of survival. And it's an advantage for mom too, because if that cub survives, she will have cubs of her own in a couple of years, and that helps to pass mom's genetics on in the population in addition to her own cubs. Males don't have it as lucky. They disperse very widely from their mother's home range. And bears from the Berkshires could end up in the Connecticut River Valley or even cross the Connecticut River into eastern Mass. They can end up in Vermont, New Hampshire, New York, Connecticut, can move very long distances. Adult males are solitary with the exception of the mating season when they'll greatly expand their home ranges to overlap with multiple females. They'll move around a lot and try to visit and mate with as many females as they can during that season. For our study, most females, once they've reached maturity, are somewhere around 200 pounds up to 225 or so. But mature females can really be anywhere from 140 to over 100 or to over 300 pounds, depending on where they live. Bears in more rural areas that are eating just natural foods are more likely to be on the lower end at weight scale. Bears that are feeding in corn, bird feeders regularly, those kind of things are going to be in the upper range of those scales. Males can easily be 450 to 500 pounds and can reach that size at a very young age. By 3 or 4 years of age, they can be upwards of 400 pounds. So bears are omnivores. That means they eat basically a wide both plant and animal matter. And they're opportunistic omnivores, is meaning they'll eat just about anything that comes in front of them. Despite the fact they'll eat meat, 90–95% of a black bear diet is vegetation. They're not a true predator like a bobcat or a fisher that hunt down their prey. The meat in their diet is going to be mostly from scavenging, maybe on dead carcasses, possibly feeding on deer fawns in spring that can't escape when they're very young. In the spring, the bulk of bear's diet is just green leafy vegetation. So the early shoots, grasses, that lush vegetation that's high in protein as it first emerges is really key from getting them from when they come out of the den till when more foods are available later in the summer. Skunk cabbage is an extremely important food for bears in the spring in Massachusetts. They'll also eat leftover acorns, beech nuts, hickory nuts that fell the previous fall. Carrion, so take advantage of carcasses, and deer fawns, as I said before. In the spring, there's not a lot of food available to bears, so we do see high use of human-associated foods, bird feeders, and garbage at this time of year. Throughout the year, the habitats, so the forests, wetlands, the environments that we're going to find bears in is where they can seasonally find those foods. So in the spring, it tends to be in wetlands where you have skunk cabbage, other lush vegetation that first emerges. As the seasons progress, bear diet is going to change as different foods become available. So throughout the summer, as insect nests become active, so ants, bees, wasp nests, beetle larvae, they'll eat the larvae in these nests, they'll eat honey, and so they'll dig those out of rotten trees and fallen logs. Soft mast or berries are an extremely important food component for bears. So as soon as the first strawberries are out in the spring, blackberries, raspberries, blueberries, grapes, cherries, apples, all those things are key food types for black bears. Unfortunately, they'll also take advantage of other fruits and crops, corn and apples being the two big ones. Black bears can do an enormous amount of damage in cornfields, and that kind of conflict is one of the most difficult ones to manage and mitigate. In the summer, they can be found where these foods are found, in upland forests, in logged areas. Logged areas have down logs and tree trunks that are on the ground that eventually rot and become great places to find those insects we just talked about. They also are places that let in a lot of light, so you tend to have blueberries and raspberries that grow in those in the first few years. So those can be really key habitats. They'll continue to use wetlands and use fields and orchards as well. As we move into fall, bears enter a state that's called hyperphagia. This is essentially an absolute compulsion in bears to eat as much as they possibly can. This is the time of year where they really gain weight and put on the fat reserves they need for hibernation. So they'll continue to eat corn and apples at this time, but hard mast or acorns, beech nuts, hickory nuts are extremely important fall foods. Acorns and beech nuts are really favored food items. Beech nuts may be the most, but they can be pretty irregular in terms of when you have good nutting years for beech. They'll also take advantage of deer carcasses in the fall from the hunting season. In fall, they tend to be in upland forests, fields, and orchards. So we talked about bears hibernating, and when do they do it? Bears undergo something called delayed implantation. So in their mating season, as I mentioned, it peaks in June. The egg is fertilized at that time and it begins to develop, but it doesn't implant in the uterine wall. It remains floating. It's not until just before they're about ready to enter then where the female undergoes hormonal and physiological changes. It causes the egg to implant in the uterine wall, and that basically tells her it's time to den. The pregnancy then develops at that point, and she'll give birth a couple months later. But because of this, we see bears very regularly pregnant females very regularly entering the den right around November 1st. And that tends to be pretty much like clockwork every year. The females who have 1-year-old cubs with them, or males or young bears that are denning on their own, can be anywhere from that time to later in November, December, or even not at all, depending on the conditions. This winter, for example, we've seen many of our females with yearling cubs remaining active and semi-active and continuing to be out and searching for food because it's readily available, because there's not a lot of snow on the ground. The variability tends to be caused by the availability of food and weather conditions. If we were to suddenly get 3 feet of snow, they can't access food, they're far more likely to den. And they remain in the den for 4 to 5 months. And during that time, they don't eat anything, they don't drink anything, they don't urinate, defecate. So they're basically solely relying on processing their fat and metabolizing the fat reserves that they've had to survive. So why do they hibernate? It's an adaptation that they have to the seasonal food shortage. Being primarily a vegetarian, for a large animal like a bear who can't process woody vegetation, they don't have the stomach that moose and deer and browsers have. There's not a lot of food available to them. So they've evolved to try to sleep off, reduce their metabolism, and live off those reserves of fat at that time. But what that means is they have to gain all the weight and fat they need to survive hibernation in the few 6, 7, 8 months that they're active. As a result, they've evolved to and adapted to search for calorie-rich foods. This is where you see bears eating on salmon runs and just being really gluttons there. A bear under a big oak tree will just sit there and shovel acorns into their mouth and just try to eat as much as they possibly can. Unfortunately, in developed places like Massachusetts, we in modern society readily supply food as well, and high-calorie foods, bird feeders, garbage, and other food sources, and this is what tends to lead to conflict with bears. So this is the current bear range in Massachusetts. This gray-blue area is where we have, we know we have females, they're producing cubs, active reproduction. We have females, probably a few in this orange or brown area, but that's really where our bears are expanding into as they encroach on the outer Boston suburbs. Most of the bears in that area are young males that are dispersing, can't compete with the large males for territories in the established range. But our bear range is encroaching ever closer to the coast. In pre-European colonization times, bears were found, Massachusetts was almost all forested, and bears were found all the way to the coast. When European colonists came, they hunted bears year-round for food, for fur, for their pelts, but also as pests and predators. They also cut down all the forests and converted it into farmland. So the combination of unregulated hunting and the loss of habitat meant that our bear population was almost extirpated in the state. We ended up with just a small remnant population in the northern Berkshires. And it's the slow growth and recovery of that population as farms were abandoned and forests grew back. We started protecting for the future land in state forest, wildlife management areas, and private conservation lands. And our agency came into being, and we regulated the hunting season. We still have a hunting season for bears, but we restrict how long it is, the number of bears that can be taken, et cetera. And that has allowed the growth and recovery of black bears to much of their historic range. One of the best ways to visualize the growth of the population over time is looking where bears have been taken during the hunting season. If we go back to 1980, there were only 10 bears taken in the entire state in the hunting season, and all of those in the northern Berkshires where that remnant population existed. And in reality, you can see there's 2 bears taken here, but there's obviously bears all around the northern Berkshires at that time. These are just the bears that are being taken in the hunting season. But the population's continuing to grow at this point. By 10 years later, bears have likely crossed the Connecticut River and are in eastern Mass. They've crossed the Mass Pike and are pushing down into Connecticut. 10 years after that, you can see much more widespread harvest, 6 bears in its individual town as the population density is really starting to increase. Bears are certainly established in Connecticut, and the population is growing there, unchecked, as we'll talk about in a minute, because they don't have any hunting season, so there's no control on the population there. Over time, we can see that now bears are expanding further into the east, and we're getting more regular hunting of bears in eastern Massachusetts. By around the mid 2010s and 2015s, you can see the large number of bears that were being taken in the hunting season along the Connecticut border. At this point, the Connecticut population has really exploded since colonizing from Massachusetts 20 to 30 years before. It's grown unchecked. And so now they're kind of pushing back into Massachusetts from Connecticut. And we see these patterns continue where we now have high densities of bears in more and more places throughout the state. And what we're seeing now in central Mass is what we saw in the Berkshires 30 years before. So that's one means of determining where we have bears in the state. Another means is by looking at calls to our agency, sightings, complaints from the public, or to the environmental police. The environmental police are a law enforcement agency. And so all their calls are logged officially in their system. So this gives a pretty good distribution of where bears are in the state generally. You can see even one here in Arlington, and that's a bear that we relocated out of Arlington in the summer of 2019. And so that's how we kind of have an idea of where bears are living in the state and the relative densities of bears we have in these different places. But that's just a small component of the information we need to accurately manage black bears in the state. So we want to know about what's happening with the population. And so in order to do that, and so if you're a wildlife manager, you have a bear population at a certain point in time T, and you want to know what's going to happen to it in the future. You need to have information on the number of cubs, yearlings, juveniles, adult bears, what is their survival rate to those next generations, and the amount of cubs that they produce in each generation. If you have all those pieces of information, you can predict what the population's going to be in the future. But that's a lot of information to get. So we, as a state agency, have been in collaboration with UMass conducting research on black bears since the early or I guess the mid 1980s. And so our main means of getting some of that information is by putting tracking collars on black bears. So our main means of getting new bears now is through these barrel traps. So this is 2.5 55-gallon drums that are welded together. There's a bait bag in the far end of this trap. The bear crawls into the trap. Even this large male here will squeeze himself into that trap. When they grab that bait bag, the wire it's attached to that runs along the top of the trap is pulled out from underneath this door. The door slides shut and the bear's trapped inside. Once the bear's inside and closed, we can tranquilize it using a syringe, a tranquilizer and syringe on the end of a pole. So basically just like getting a shot at the doctor and the bear goes to sleep right in the trap. We then crawl into the trap and haul the bear out, and we can then work it up and process the bear. Occasionally on the right, we have the opportunity to, if there's a female with cubs in a tree in an urban or suburban setting, we can opportunistically take advantage of that, potentially dart the bear and get a collar on a bear in a place where we wouldn't normally trap and we might not get the information otherwise. Once we've pulled the bear out of the trap, all the bears get ear tags. So these are uniquely identifiable ear tags so that if the bear wanders into New York and is taken in their hunting season, it's involved in a vehicle collision or it's involved in some nuisance behavior, we know the history of that bear, we've handled it, perhaps how old it is, et cetera, how far it's dispersed from that trapping site. So all bears, male and female, get ear tags when we trap them. The females get a tracking collar. So traditionally it was a collar that just put out a pulsing signal, and then we can tune a receiver to specifically to that collar frequency, and we can locate that bear and monitor her survival. More recently, we've been using collars that have a GPS unit, and this small white little box on top of the collar is essentially a GPS unit. The collars are now taking a location every 45 minutes. So I now know where these bears are going 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. So we have very fine information on the habitat use and movements of these bears. So one of the big components is monitoring survival. So again, since the time it's trapped, she has this collar. If the bear were to die, the collar changes the pulse rate that it's emitting a signal, and we know that the animal has died. We try to walk in to determine what was the cause of death, and that starts to build that information about what's happening. If the bear survives, we then use those collars to track her to her den in the winter. So these are a variety of different dens that bears use. You can see a rock cave here. This is actually not a very common type of den in Massachusetts because that habitat just isn't very prevalent. A hollow in the top of a tree here or at the base of a large tree. We've had several dens like that this year, but quite often it's just underneath a tree root mass, or she'll make a nest underneath the logs of a fallen tree, or just in some dense briars and brush, a log pile, a variety of different things. And some females with yearlings will just make a big bird's nest on the ground out of branches and leaves, and it literally looks like a 3-4 foot wide bird nest, and they'll just curl up in there open to the elements all winter. Some will then dig a burrow like this underneath a stump or a hollow log. These are great dens because we're pretty sure that we're going to be able to successfully capture the bears in those situations. So again, we try to sneak in as quietly as we can, because bears are basically just sleeping when they're hibernating. So if you were to make a lot of noise or be talking as you walked in, she could wake up and run off, and you blow your chances of capturing her. So you sneak in, you try to again use that jab pole. So it's basically that syringe with a tranquilizer on the end of a long pole, administer the tranquilizer, and hopefully she goes to sleep right in the den. Once she has, we can then, having some issues changing slides. Once she has, we can pull her out and we can assess the fit of her collar, make sure it fits her well, replace the collar if the batteries are running low. We'll check her condition, see if there's any injuries, we'll weigh her and take other measurements. This way, you're just basically doing a once a year health check on the animal. For those females that are pregnant and have given birth, we wait a little bit of time for the newborn cubs to grow, for her to bond with them, so that if she were to run off, she's going to come back to them. So we don't handle these bears until the cubs are around 6 to 8 weeks of age. So we begin doing this work the end of February and into March. And so once she's tranquilized, these cubs can be handled. And so we count the number of cubs she's given birth to. So you now know that she produced 3 cubs in a certain year. We determine the sex of the animals and we weigh them and generally assess their conditions. We'll then pop her back in the den. We'll tuck the cubs in right nicely with her, and they'll stay in the den again for the rest of the winter and emerge at the beginning of April. As I said before, those cubs will stay with her for the next year and den with her again as 1-year-old bears. We can tranquilize mom and one at a time tranquilize the cubs after that. In this way, we knew this female had 3 cubs the year before. She has 2 with her now, so one of those didn't survive the first year. Another piece of information to build the picture. All those cubs get the ear tags, like I mentioned before, and this is a 1-year-old female that has an expandable collar on her. The collar can accommodate her growth, and in this way, we can monitor not only obviously her survival from when she's a newborn cub to now 1 year old, but as she goes on her own, her survival to 2. And then when she eventually begins to have cubs, how many cubs she has, and survival throughout her life. So you can get a really complete picture of the life history of a bear in this way. So for example, this is a collared female that we had collared in Paxton, so a suburb of Worcester. She has a GPS collar. This is her male yearling after they've emerged from the den in the spring, and her female yearling with an expandable collar. We've already done the den with this bear. She's denned as a 2-year-old this winter by herself for the first time, and she was denned about 100 yards from the runway of the Worcester Airport. She got a full-size GPS collar on her, so we'll now get information as she establishes a territory somewhere on the outskirts of Worcester and how she survives and makes her way through her life from there. So by having this research project over the years, we have very good information on adult female survival, and it's quite high. So 88% survival rate for females. And this is the main factor that determines whether or not the population is increasing, stable, or decreasing. If you have high adult female survival, you're going to have a growing population like we've seen in the past. There's very little natural mortality for bears. We've only documented a couple of bears that have died from natural causes. Most ends up being hunting season, vehicle collisions, or nuisance kills by the public tend to be the predominant causes of death in bears in our population. We know the age that they first have cubs. It tends to be at 3 or 4 years of age. Almost all of our bears now are giving birth at 3 years of age. It used to be we had more bears collared up in the hills in the Berkshires, and some of those bears didn't give birth until they were 4 years old. Almost all of ours are giving birth at 3 now. We know that first litter size, it tends to be quite small. On average, 1 to 2 cubs for that first litter, and then 2, 3, 4 cubs thereafter. It also tends to be small cubs. So these cubs were handled in back-to-back days. This was a first-time mom up in the hills. This was a mature female down in the suburbs. And these cubs are basically, it's all you can do to hold on to them. They're little balls of muscle and they're ready to go. So that's the differences between a first-time mom and a mature female. And also, unfortunately, those first-time moms are not very good mothers. Quite often, those they do not keep their cubs the first year. They're not in super great body conditions, so the cubs are weak to begin with. But the female doesn't have the fat reserve, so she may lose her milk. She may move around too much, and so putting the cubs in risky situations. And so, just overall, the survival is poorer for those females and for those cubs than it is for mature females. And as I've said, over the years, we learn causes of mortality in the population. So we start to get all of those pieces of information we need to model the population and growth over time. And we've done this. One of the original studies was to conduct a really strong population density when we had relatively low densities in the state. And then we've used all these other parameters, the survival, the cub production, et cetera, to project growth in the population. Now, the model is rather simplistic. It doesn't take absolutely everything into account. And so if that model were to continue, by now we'd be on the order of nearly 10,000 bears in the state, which isn't realistic. But what we know is that those demographic rates, the survival, the reproductive rates, are consistent to what they've been historically, and those rates have allowed growth in the population. So one of the things I always get asked is, like, how many bears are there in the state? And quite frankly, as a manager, that's not as important as what's happening with the population. We know we have abundant bears and that these survival parameters are strong, so we're going to continue to have growth of our population as we've seen in the past. This graph summarizes as our population has increased, this is the number of bears that we've taken during our hunting season. And you saw this in those figures early. You know, it was just a few bears early on, but it's increased over time as the population has expanded. As it's done so, we've adjusted those seasons to increase the season length. Again, hunting is really our only means of providing some control of the growth of the population. And part of the reason for doing that is to maintain bears at a population level where they don't cause so much conflict. There's going to be conflict with bears, but we don't want bears to become a nuisance animal. For example, in Connecticut, a couple of years ago, they had almost 50 home entries by bears, compared to around 3 or 4 in Massachusetts. So that's kind of the difference with an unhunted and a hunted population, where some of those nuisance behaviors can hit a point where the public no longer values having bears around, and they're seen as more of a nuisance than a valued animal that we want to protect. Hunting has increased in Eastern Mass, and we're now starting to see what we saw again 20 to 30 years before in Western Mass. So we can project that the population is going to continue to increase as we've kind of hit critical masses of bears in Eastern Mass. I'm now going to start to kind of the new portion of the study that I started when I was at UMass. And so I'm going to show you some of the data we get from the GPS collars. And so each one of the clusters of dots you're going to see here of the same color is an individual female. Every single one of the dots is where she was in one of those 45-minute fixes, those GPS locations that are stored on the collar. So keep in mind, this is only collared females. There's additional females out there that we don't have collared. There's males, there's young bears. But I think this gives you an idea of how many bears there are on the landscape and how much they're living amongst us. Massachusetts truly is black bear country, and bears are in yards, next to schools, next to playgrounds, in and amongst us on a daily basis. And I think this figure makes that pretty clear. So closer to home, once I took my position here, we started doing collaring work out in the Berkshires as well, primarily in the Housatonic Valley. So on the west, you can see, or on the right-hand side, you can see Pittsfield, Lenox, and on the left, you can see where we have our collared bears in there. And so this is a collared female. Someone mentioned seeing a bear in downtown Lenox in a highly developed area. That collared female uses Lenox in the very developed portions of town. These bears up here are using the suburbs and in small little habitat patches in and around the city of Pittsfield. So same situation again, just because you don't see bears here, doesn't mean there aren't many bears that are living in those areas. This is just the portion that we've captured. So one of the components of the research, we had a postdoc at UMass who was working on this project for us, and she was looking at the factors of the landscape that affected bears' movements. So what features helped that bears were free to move through? So forests and wetlands, you would presume, would be those things that would allow bears to move freely across the landscape. Whereas what features prevented bears' movement? So different types of development, residential areas, more urban development, agricultural land, different types of topography, steep hills, open wetlands. What were the features that helped to facilitate bear movements, and what blocked them? And you can see on the left, this hatched area here is agricultural land. And so despite the bears using corn during the late summer, they don't like to move through those areas. They're using just the little wetland strips and forest strips to navigate this area, and then using the large blocks of forest, the dark green here. This is a more residential and suburban area here. And again, the bears' movements are concentrated to these little strips. So these are those protected wetlands areas, local conservation areas, and little movement corridors. And the bears are very much using those in order to survive and use these landscapes. Another thing we can do is take the results from those models, the different features that either helped or hindered bear movements, and we can say, okay, if we have a bear up here in the northwest corner of the state, how is it going to get down here to the southern Berkshires? And you can run lots of simulations that come up with variable paths that the bears will take to get there. Where you have these dark green lines are indications that lots of these simulated paths move through that area. And so in this way, we can identify potential places where there's currently connectivity on the landscape. So habitat connectivity that bears are able to move through. And we can use this as a conservation tool to prioritize habitat purchases, et cetera, to preserve that connectivity, to make sure we can ensure that we have good habitat and connected habitat for species like bear and large animals to use. But also, if we can conserve that sort of habitat, we can likely protect habitat for our endangered species and other less mobile species. And really, one of the keys to that is habitat protection and conservation. All these green polygons, again, this is the city of Pittsfield. This is getting up into the Berkshires, October Mountain State Forest here. All these green patches are protected conservation lands. And we've done a really good job of conserving wildlife habitat in Massachusetts. And that's one of the things that's allowed species like moose populations to expand, some of our endangered species populations to recover. And it's a key component, as all of you know, as you just look around Massachusetts, the amount of development that's happening, conserving habitat and conserving connectivity between these natural habitats is going to be even more important moving forward for our wildlife to exist in the future. If we look at this from a different perspective, the red areas are state properties. So state forests, wildlife management areas, properties that are owned by the state. These orange ones are town watershed lands. So City of Pittsfield watershed, for example, this one right here. The blues are private conservation restrictions, and then the yellows are land trust properties. So these are properties that are managed by Berkshire Natural Resources Council or other land conservation agencies. And you can see, while obviously the state lands is larger in area, that these properties, both the private as well as these land trusts, are really critical as well. Because if you were to eliminate them from the landscape, all of a sudden these red patches start to look isolated. So in many places, it's these private conservation or the land trust properties that maintain the connectivity with these larger blocks of forest that are protected by the state. Or for example, in the Housatonic Valley, almost this entire ridge here is protected by a combination of watershed lands and land trust lands. And there's no, except for down here, state property there. And so it's the land trust and these private organizations and NGOs that are helping to conserve habitats and connectivity for our wildlife that's going to be critical for their future. So again, just a solicitation, I suppose, on my part. If you choose to, please do support, whether it's Berkshire Natural Resources Council or any other land trust that you happen to support. That work is critical and is going to be critical for conservation moving forward in the state. So one of the big challenges I have, I'm going to kind of transition now into our management of bears and how we deal with it, is we have done a good job of conserving habitat. So this sort of habitat configuration is something we see all over Massachusetts. We've got very good wetland protection laws. So you see wetlands in good shape, forest blocks, but you're also seeing development that's puncturing into those blocks. And so this is all great wildlife habitat, and bears can move all throughout here. So my job is to convince people that are living in these neighborhoods here, that are at picnic in the backyard, kids playing in the street, that the decisions we make around our homes and communities determines how much it's this as well. Because this picture is taken in this neighborhood right here, a collared female, 3 yearling cubs that are regularly spending time in backyards and in neighborhoods. And I need the public's help in order to try to mitigate this, because my goal is to have healthy black bear populations living in the natural habitats, feeding on natural foods, and living compatibly with modern human society. So going back to the beginning, why do bears hibernate? It's to cope with that seasonal food shortage. But what does this mean? This means that they've evolved to basically be eating machines. They're basically like a stomach on legs. And so they are going to search for calorie-rich foods year round. That's what a bear is. Unfortunately, they're going to take advantage of those foods that we readily provide around our homes, neighborhoods, and communities. And this is the root cause of human-bear conflict. The number one cause of conflict with bears is bird feeders, undoubtedly. And anyone who tells you it's a bird feeder is a dirty, rotten liar in my eyes. These are wildlife feeders, whether it's the squirrels and the chipmunks that most bird feeders don't like, or if it's the bears, the flock of turkeys that, believe it or not, we have a lot of conflict with, as they're attracted in large numbers to backyards and people who are putting out enormous amounts of food for them. The coyotes and other animals that come to backyards for these foods. But for bears, bird feeders are irresistible. This is basically like putting a jar of peanut butter out there for the bear to eat in terms of the amount of calories that they can get. And they can go one house to the next, and then people refill them the very next day. So it becomes, compared to looking for ants in the forest or some berries or some acorns, this is the place now that bears are learning to feed, in backyards, because of bird feeders. I've got this bear in the upper left circle. This is one of our collared 1-year-old females. As soon as she dispersed from mom, we started getting calls on her, basically because mom trained her to come to backyards to find foods. She's now around 6 or 7 years old. She's having newborn cubs in a very highly developed area, and she's become a habitual raider of chicken coops, and we get calls on her on a regular basis. And it all stems from learning these behaviors when she was a cub. This photo on the right, I stole from a district manager that someone had sent him, and basically they end up being frantic. They are frantic when they call and they're saying, what are you going to do about your bear? It's on my deck and it won't go away and it keeps coming back for my bird feeder. And the answer is, I can't do anything if that bird feeder doesn't go away. Because as you saw when I showed you the data, there are many bears around. So say we did take action on this bear, even though it's not doing anything wrong, there are many bears that are going to come and do the same exact thing. So removing that bear doesn't solve the problem at all. The food source has to be remained. Each time the bear gets these food rewards, it's basically being trained to come around homes, onto decks, up next to our houses, into our neighborhoods to try to find food. They learn where the feeders are. They learn the association. So decks are great places to look for bird feeders. And so they go in those places door to door to door. And the problems won't end if the feeders aren't removed. So in case you didn't get the point, no bird feeders. Certainly no bird feeders in that period of time when bears are active. And really that means from almost January, your only window is kind of January to early March is the one safe time of year where maybe you can have bird feeders. But every year we have bears that remain active all winter because the bird feeders essentially remove that need to hibernate because there's a reliable source of food for them. Garbage is another big one. So household garbage, it's important to store your garbage in a shed or a garage, a secure building where the bears can't access it. Put it out the morning of pickup, not the night before. Put it out in a can, hopefully a secure can, not just in a bag. This is really key. If you're having problems with bears in your trash and you don't have a garage or shed, Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation put together plans, very detailed plans to build these kind of garbage. You can see a garbage can there, basically a small shed that's just big enough to fit your garbage can inside. They have the number of boards you need, the length of boards you need, step-by-step instructions that even if you're not familiar with carpentry and those kind of things, you could follow these plans and make one of these sheds for your garbage if you're having an issue. We have PDFs available at all our offices. You can contact me if you need those plans and I can send them to you to use. Dumpsters are an enormous issue with bears because they create a potentially dangerous situation. These tend to be at group living facilities, so apartment complexes or retirement homes. Obviously, restaurant dumpsters are great for bears. In the Berkshires, it tends to be trailer or RV parks, summer camps, and campgrounds. Basically, these are places where many people are going and putting garbage in on a daily basis. If bears can access the garbage in those dumpsters and they're regularly in there, think about the person who's going to that dumpster after dark. They're gonna put their garbage in there and the bear happens to be in there. Now you're in very close proximity to the bear, and that's where the potential for someone being injured by a bear exists. And so this is why this is a big issue. So for dumpsters, it's extremely important. Metal top dumpsters, if you're having issues with bears getting into a dumpster, know someone it is, metal top dumpsters are key. Most trash companies will provide metal top dumpsters upon request. There is more of a fee for them, but it will solve the problem. It will help to protect our bears. Regardless of what type of dumpster you have, making sure the doors are closed, the latches are clipped, the roll bars down are really key to make sure the garbage obviously isn't overflowing, et cetera, to prevent bears from learning to access the trash. Because these food sources are the reason that the bear is in the backyard. If those food sources are removed, the bear's going to go back to the forest and the wetlands to find food. As I mentioned, the females teach their cubs those behaviors as soon as they emerge. And over time, that boldness increases. It goes from being comfortable in the backyard, eating at the bird feeder, to breaking into the shed to access bird seed, to, unfortunately, some people store bird seed and garbage on screen porches. Obviously, the bear can smell it on there. The screen porch provides no resistance for the bear going on to getting it. Now that starts to blur the line, and all of a sudden that bear is thinking about entering homes. And so these obviously are the things we don't want to have happen. The more time bears spend around, you saw all that data about bears in and amongst communities, in Pittsfield, in Lenox, in all these developed places. We can tolerate that as managers because black bears aren't inherently aggressive towards people. What we're trying to prevent here is the chance negative encounter. You open the sliding glass door to let the dog out. There's a bear feeding at your bird feeder. All of a sudden the bear and dog are in conflict. You're going to run out there to try to save your dog. You're going to lose that confrontation. Again, you're going to the dumpster or to your trash can if the bear's in it. Close proximity, and someone gets injured as a result. So that's why we have this messaging about trying to secure these food sources. One of the biggest issues with bears is backyard chicken farming. This has become incredibly popular, backyard chicken coops in Massachusetts. The same goes for backyard beehives. This figure grossly underestimates the number of backyard chicken coops that there are out there, but you'll get the idea. When you have all these bears out there, they're coming to backyards to feed at bird feeders and other things. They're learning as they're there that chickens are there. Chickens are an easy meal, eggs, chicken feed. You can't build a chicken coop that's strong enough to keep even a young bear out. They'll just tear it open like it's not even there. And so it's really important. Every year I'm getting bears killed, some collared bears killed, raiding chicken coops as they're learning these behaviors. And if I'm getting collared bears killed, that means many, many, many bears are being killed that way every year as a result of this. You can see the damage on beehives that a bear can do in a very short period of time. There is a tool that can help. Electric fencing. It is really critical that all chicken coops and beehives are protected with electric fencing. They're safe around kids, they're safe around pets, and they're pretty easy to use. And your goal is to build something that's going to actually protect your resource, that what you're trying to protect. So designing and maintaining a fence that will actually do that is really key. We've put together a complete electric fencing guide, again, step-by-step instructions, materials, tips to make it effective. This is available on our website, mass.gov/bears. You can see it right down here. It's available. Electric fencing guide is available as a PDF on there, free for download. There's also a tab that says protect your bees and chickens, and it's available there. If you have bees and chickens, please use electric fencing. If you know people that do, please try to spread this word. We're trying to get the word out there and get everyone to be using electric fencing. There's a lot more information available on our website on how to coexist with bears, and that's free for you. And really, all the conflict with bears stems from human-associated foods, and the bears aren't going to change. As I said, they've evolved to take advantage of these meals. That's what a bear is. So really, people must change in order to prevent this sort of conflict. And I need the help. You know, again, the goal is to conserve healthy wildlife populations, and that's something that I need your help for. Again, conserving land, Berkshire Natural Resources Council, one of the many great agencies, NGOs in the state that are trying to help conserve our natural resources, and we greatly appreciate that. If you ever have any conflict with bears, mass.gov/bears. Environmental Police Dispatch is available 24/7. And there's always someone there to answer that phone. The regional office out your way is in Dalton. That's their number. I'm out of the Westboro office, and we're here to help answer questions and help you resolve conflict with bears, or answer questions about basic ecology or any other issues you have related to wildlife. We are a resource for you. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Dave. I just want to say, wow, first of all, that's a lot of wonderful educational information for all of us about habitat needs, population information, bear safety, all essential things for us to know. Yeah, like Dave said, we'll open it up to questions now. I would request if you have a question to input it into the chat, and we'll keep track of them because I imagine we'll have a lot, and then ask them directly to Dave. You're also welcome to virtually raise your hand, and we'll keep track of that as well and call on you when it has come up. We did have one question early on. Oh, I'll also mention Dave has kindly offered to answer questions about moose as well. So the first question we had early on came from Sarah, who said, has Massachusetts implemented any restrictions on bird feeders? I think you covered that a little bit, but I wondered if you wanted to say anything else about that.
Yep. There unfortunately isn't a, it's obviously a controversial thing. A lot of people really enjoy feeding the birds, so it's a difficult issue to tackle. So there is not a state prohibition on bird feeders. Some local towns do have town ordinances that restrict bird feeder use or in other food sources, or put limits on it that if they're attracting bears or other nuisance wildlife, then at that point it would become a violation. So there are some local ordinances for that.
Thank you. So we did have a few folks raise their hand. Mary Ann, you can unmute if. And ask your
Thank you.
Great.
Yeah, that was before I found the chat. I'm wondering, are they more active at a particular time of day, and does it vary with season?
Yep, and so the tracking collars actually have an activity switch. So basically, it's like the bubble in a level, if you will. So when the bear is moving, as long as that basically records the activity, and we can plot that and see when they're more active or less active. And it does vary by season. It varies by individual. Some bears have shown that, particularly in spring, when there's not a lot of natural food out there, and they're using backyards and things more often, that they'll be more active at night. But then that same bear, as natural foods become available, they'll transition into a pattern where they're more active during the day or dawn and dusk sort of periods. I'd say dawn and dusk, daytime activity tends to be more than nighttime activity, but it does vary by individual and vary by season.
Thank you. Also call on George Tibbetts.
Hi, so I was curious if like our bear conservation efforts within the state started with the Pittman-Robertson Act of '37, or if we started getting more into it later. I was more just curious about when we really started putting an effort towards bringing bears back to the state.
Yeah, so the Pittman-Robertson Act is kind of the key way that MassWildlife as an agency is funded. It's basically a federal tax on ammunition and firearm sales that we get reimbursed for money we spend for conservation. So for example, all of the research that we're doing is reimbursed through the Pittman-Robertson Act. So without that, we wouldn't have anywhere near the resources that we have to do the research on bears and do the other work we do as an agency. I should say the other main means that we get our money is through the sale of hunting licenses and fishing licenses, the direct way we get our money. Really, the efforts to strongly conserve bears started after the Pittman-Robertson Act. It was kind of in the 50s and then in the 70s where we went from an open season still on bears where they could be hunted year round to put restrictive seasons in. And it's really in the early 70s where the more modern framework, where in the 70s, we went down to a single week of black bear hunting. And then it was slowly expanded over time as the population grew. But that's kind of when the things changed drastically, was around 1970.
All right, we have a question from Patrick. He says, I know you touched on this, but he asks, do bears actually hibernate or is it torpor?
Yeah, so it's more of like a sleep. So animals like woodchucks and chipmunks are true hibernators. So that's where their metabolic rates go way down and they basically become unresponsive. And so it takes them a while to wake up in the spring. So they slowly increase in activity and their metabolic rate increases over time. Black bears, just like that, they can wake up in be active again. And so it's more their metabolic rates do decrease, but it's kind of just they're taking a nap for the most part. And so that's where we have to be very careful when we're doing the den work, so as we don't scare them off, because it really is just kind of asleep.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, so we have another question from Thomas. Do you see a steady migration of bears towards Eastern Mass?
Yeah, it's not necessarily a migration. It's kind of that leading edge of the range pushing further and further east. And so this is, you saw at the beginning where bears crossed the Connecticut River sometime in the 1990s, and they slowly progressed there. The real expansion of the range is controlled by the dispersal of females. Obviously, they're the ones that are going to produce the cubs. And since they tend to use a portion of their mom's range rather than disperse a long distance, every time they hit a barrier like the Connecticut River or a major highway or something, it slows down that expansion to the east. It takes a female to cross that barrier, establish herself on the other side, begin to produce cubs, and then another female comes over. Their offspring produce cubs, and now the population grows in that area and expands further east. But yes, we're continuing to see it march to the east.
Great, thank you. We have another question from Andrea, and she asks, is planting native berry bushes close to one's house going to facilitate bears coming too close? And then a kind of related question, what about compost piles?
We don't tend to see too many complaints about compost piles. They certainly can get into them. So, I certainly wouldn't recommend putting meat products in your compost. If you do see that you're having a bear get into your compost, maybe one of those, black bins that are secure and it's not as easy for them to get into. But I don't get very many complaints about compost. The berry question is a good one. We provide that as an alternative to bird feeders and other things. If you want to attract birds, having native plantings with flowers, etc. And obviously, I have blueberry bushes in my yard though. So I think the key there, and if you have apple trees or other trees that then drop fruit, is to pick the fruit when it's ripe. Don't let it fall on the ground. If it does fall on the ground, clean it up so that you don't have something lingering that's going to be an attractant. You may get bears coming in there. Again, that could be something, if you have a lot of fruit, you could consider using electric fencing around it to protect that as well.
So we've had a few questions that kind of get to the same question, but someone said, I've encountered bears several times while walking in my neighborhood. What should I do? Many folks are asking about potential interactions on hiking. This person said, I usually turn around, not always convenient. I have heard people carry bells, spray, etc. What do you recommend?
Yeah, and so whether it's in your backyard or on a hiking trail, the key there is to give the bear space. So if you happen to be going out in your backyard and there's a bear there, kind of let it know you're there is kind of key too, so you don't surprise it at very close range. So just talking to it, you putting up your hand, say, hey bear, I'm over here. I'm now just gonna back out of here, and then increasing space between you and the animal. If you encounter one on the trail, talk to it in a calm but assertive voice and slowly back up to increase. You do kind of want to keep watching the animal just so you know what it's doing, and just slowly back up. You don't want to run. You never want to run from a wild animal. That can spur a natural chase instinct in them. So slowly increasing your space is really key. Making noise in the trail, so the bells and those kind of things can do it. So again, that's to prevent you from surprising the animal. They can hear those bells, and so it's not you just suddenly turn a corner and you're right next to the bear without them hearing you coming. That's the benefit of having bells, or being out with someone and talking so that you can actually be heard. Certainly, if for those folks that are afraid to walk out in the woods or in their neighborhood, we get this all the time with coyotes too. People are afraid to walk their dogs or whatnot. They do make a product called bear spray. Essentially, it's pepper spray. It's designed to repel brown bears, a far, far larger and more aggressive bear species that's found out in the Rocky Mountains in Canada and Alaska. And basically, it puts out a cloud of pepper spray out to about 20 or 30 feet. So if you were to encounter a bear and it continued to approach you to that distance, it can basically be worn on a holster on your belt. You just pull it out, spray it. And then once you've sprayed it, the bear is going to run off, back up, get out of there, leave the area. But again, we can take advantage of the fact that while predatory encounters with black bears have occurred, so I can't say that will never happen. It is exceptionally rare. They're really not inherently aggressive. If you're ever out hiking and a bear is, you start backing away and it's following you persistently and it doesn't respond to you backing up and talking to it, that's a bear more to be concerned about. And you really want to get out of there and do everything you can to avoid that bear if you can. Very, very, very rare if that for that kind of thing to occur. But the pepper spray can be a kind of an insurance policy, if you will, to carry with you. It's either available online or some gun shops in like outdoor fitters like Cabela's might carry it. I would recommend calling first because not all of them do, see if they have some in stock, but it is available online.
Great, thank you. So we have another kind of related question. Are there any thoughts about creating regulations, for example, to remove beekeeping away from houses, or using any sort of like bottles or barrels suspended or affixed to trees?
For bees, yeah, I mean, I think, as an agency and as a state and community, I think there's strong support for activities like beekeeping for the important role that they play. And we're not trying to restrict people from doing that. And really, if you build a good electric fence, and the guide that we have really lays out how we would recommend that be done, you're very rarely going to have issues with bears if you use those things. So some of the things, bears can readily climb trees, so trying to hang something in a tree or whatnot isn't necessarily going to do you all that much good. I really would recommend the electric fencing. There's a lot of beekeepers that have had bees for a very long time in high densities of bears and can be successful doing so with electric fencing.
Thanks, Dave. Bonnie Peters, you've had your hand raised for a while. Thank you for your patience.
No, that's okay. I live in Lee, and I have the runoff to the goose pond in my backyard. For the last 3 years, I've had a female bear in my backyard. Well, this past year, she brought 4 of the cutest little cubs into my backyard, but she left them and walked back to the other side of the river, of the stream. And she just sat there watching them. And they were like, they jumped on my son's trampoline, played around. They looked like a bunch of little toddlers. And then they didn't leave until my son made some noise, but they don't get into my trash. We've had a bird feeder that's up in a tree, propelled between 2 trees about 15 feet up. They don't bother that. Like I said, she used to just come and roll around in our backyard. She makes it very, very weird to have a child because my son thinks she's a cute little teddy bear because she doesn't get into our garbage. She's not a nuisance. And like I said, this past year, she brought her babies, put them in our backyard like she was dropping off, walked back over, and they were in our backyard for probably 45 minutes. And she sat there watching them though. And it was the weirdest thing. I've never encountered anything quite like it, but I was concerned because not everybody's like us and just going to sit there and enjoy them. And should I have called the police? Should I have done something else?
Yeah, I wouldn't say call the police. I mean, there's not really much that they're going to do in that kind of situation. In reality, it's like, as I said, if you have a bear in your backyard, the best thing to do is kind of let it do its thing. Don't, try to get out there and get a picture and get closer for that kind of thing. Give it space. And when it's done, it's gonna move on. If, you wanted to be using your backyard for some reason and the bear's out there, you can try to scare it off. I generally speaking, don't recommend to folks to haze bears the way I do for coyotes. If a coyote is in your yard and you don't want it there, I'll tell people to aggressively haze it, physically chase it out of the yard. The coyote's going to run off. A bear is a large, powerful animal. And sometimes if you go try to haze it, it's going to say, I'm not going anywhere. And all of a sudden you've put yourself in a close situation with that bear. With actually one of the few instances where a bear's actually come into physical contact with a person was someone trying to haze it off of a pear tree. And he basically ran to within 30 feet of the bear and was yelling at it and everything. The bear decided that that was enough, and it charged him. It was basically a bluff charge, but it did knock him down. And so if you were going to try to scare them off so that mom took them away, I would recommend doing it like from the door, make some noise, but don't try to get out there. But in reality, if you enjoy having them there, it's fine to have them there. It's just, I would, again, beg you not to try to be attracting them to your home so that they're not learning bad behaviors.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
So from Rick and Susie, they're asking about beach blight and if that's affected the significance of beech nuts in their diet.
Yeah, so unfortunately, beech blight, like many of the diseases that are affecting our native tree species, is certainly something that has reduced the prevalence of big mature beech in our forest. So I do think there is some cases where we've locally lost beech or those productive big beech trees. And so certainly if those trees die, you're not going to have that sort of hard mass for them. So yeah, anytime you're losing those really dominant trees, it is going to be a reduction in the amount of beech nuts or acorns, whatever happens to be in the area.
Great, thank you. So we have a moose question. We'll break it up a little bit. Where are moose found in the state?
Pretty much from about Worcester west. Moose are mostly restricted up in the hills. They for the most part, they're going to avoid the valleys. They're going to be kind of, really from the valley floors and up. And so throughout the Berkshires, certainly a stronghold for our moose in the state, right down into Connecticut. They're much more, as you saw the bears in and amongst the development, moose are much more averse to development and being close to people. So they're going to be in the bigger blocks of woods. I mentioned the importance of young forests for bears, for finding berries and things. Logged areas are moose's #1 feeding habitat. So if you want to see a moose, go to an area that was logged 2-3 years ago. The shrubs and the saplings that are growing back in that area, which is what happens after something's logged, young forest comes in there. That's basically a buffet for a moose. So if you want to see a moose, go to those areas. Our moose are very much affected by temperature. So we're on the very southern edge of the range for moose, so they can overheat. So if it's a warm day, they're going to be in swamps and in conifer stands and things to avoid the heat of the day. So going out early in the morning or the evening is going to be your best chance to see a moose.
All right. So from David, who I assume is calling in from Connecticut, is Connecticut working with Massachusetts to coordinate responses to bears, including tagging and encouraging hunting seasons?
Yep. So there is a regional working group. So where I have an annual meeting with all of the bear biologists down to Virginia. And so we talk about different research that's happening in different states, different management issues that different states are dealing with. So there's regular interaction among states. Connecticut does have their own collaring projects, so similar to what we're doing, where they're collaring females to study what's going on in the population. I know Connecticut they're working on establishing a bear hunt in Connecticut, but it's a highly politically charged issue. Obviously not everyone is in favor of bear hunting, and so they have yet been able to establish that. But I know that is something that they have worked on.
Great, thank you. All right, a few more for you, Dave. Let's see. So we have one actually from Charlotte. What are the ecological implications of bears eating unnatural human food?
Yeah, so I mean, the impacts on that in terms of a bear's health is difficult to say. And I don't think it's something that would necessarily be understood. They certainly are larger and fatter when they have access to those things. So our females that are regularly accessing foods, human associated foods, are much heavier, much larger. They can actually produce more cubs. And so from an ecological standpoint, it can help to facilitate faster population growth. But some of these urban and suburban areas are also very risky. As I said, one of the main causes of mortality for bears is vehicle collisions. And so as bears are moving in amongst developed areas, they're crossing roads frequently, and the likelihood of them being involved in vehicle collisions is that much higher. And so we do often see that a lot of those 1- and 2-year-old bears, when they disperse from mom in developed areas, are quite often involved in vehicle collisions. So it can almost serve as a sink to the population, where it seems that they're producing lots of cubs and they're doing well, but in reality, the mortality overwhelms it in some of those areas.
Thank you. I'm curious a little bit like about plants specifically, and maybe like the dispersal of seeds, if they're not eating berries and whatnot. Has that?
Well, they still very much, like, even when they have access to bird seed and bird feeders, they still very much feed on berries. And we'll actually see that at times a year where, in midsummer, late summer, where bears that are regularly in neighborhoods, in yards, suddenly will move to the forest. And I think that's because of the availability of natural foods. And you're still seeing, if you go out in the woods, you'll see scats that are almost entirely raspberry seeds or black cherry seeds. So they still are fulfilling that role, and will still use those foods even if they have access to other foods.
Got it. Thanks so much.
All right, so another question, Vincent asks, does the Massachusetts Environmental Police have a program to relocate nuisance bears, or is that unrealistic?
Yeah, unfortunately, we get this call a lot when people, have a bear that they consider a nuisance around their property. And you see in the paper, et cetera, periodically when we in the environmental police will. So we have a large animal response team. It's a joint cooperative agreement between us and the environmental police, where if there's a bear or a moose in a highly developed area, we will relocate that animal. When we're doing that, we are resolving the simple fact that that animal is in a very, very highly developed area, and the chances of it getting out of there without being involved in a vehicle collision are very slim. So it's more to resolve the immediate location situation rather than anything that animal's doing wrong. So a bear that is regularly raiding chicken coops or in backyards and those kind of things, there's nowhere I can take an animal in Massachusetts where it wouldn't do those same behaviors to someone else. Even our largest blocks of state forests and other areas, there are people that live around there. So if you're having a bear breaking into your chicken coop or something, the last thing they want is for me to drop a bear next to them and have it potentially transfer those behaviors. So no, the policy is not to relocate nuisance animals. If unfortunately, nuisance behaviors were to escalate to the point of home entry, and generally speaking, we would give an animal, multiple strikes on that. It's not going to be coming and trying to remove it right away. But if an animal starts breaking into homes, or certainly if one breaks into contact, makes contact with a person, those are animals that we are going to lethally remove from the population just because they have become a public safety threat. But it's very, very, very rare that we take that kind of action to remove an animal. We don't do it if they're raiding chicken coops and those kind of things.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Andrea again. The relationship between bears and zoonotic diseases, are there any?
So there's with COVID now, there's lots of questions. COVID has been detected in many, many, many wildlife species. I think it's on the order, and it's kind of more species around the world, almost on a daily, weekly basis, are testing positive for COVID. So that's as we see with people, a extreme disease in terms of its infection rate and the rate of spread. So it's definitely been detected in white-tailed deer. We're actually sampling some of our bears this winter for COVID to see if they have either antibodies or if any test positive for COVID, to see if they are potentially a reservoir for it. The likelihood of transmission from a bear to people is rare. Some of the concern, I think, with wildlife getting the disease is because of the mutation rate of COVID. There is concern that of the possibility of deer or other species being a reservoir for COVID and then mutating, and then perhaps something is more likely to transmit back to people. So there is concern, and that's an active branch of research across the country and across the globe right now.
Thank you. So we have 2 more questions on the deck for you from Chad. He says, I have many moose around my property searching for sheds. Is it too late in the season to find them?
It depends on how many people are searching for sheds around your property. When we were doing the research, I found that with a lot of the large bulls that we had collared, they would drop right around Christmas or New Year's. And then smaller animals tended to retain them for longer. So most everything will be dropped at this point, and it's just a matter of whether or not they're found. You can find sheds years afterwards that are still out there in the woods. So there's likely some around. It's just a matter of going out and looking for them.
Thank you. All right. Thanks for all of your in-depth answers to these rapid fire questions.
No problem.
This last one is from Patsy, who lives in New York, and she's wondering if there are any differences in bear behavior in New York that you know of.
Not really. I mean, there are certain, regional issues depending on kind of the nature of the area. So, for example, in the Adirondacks in New York, where it's a large vacation community, I know there's a lot of issues at same with in some places in the Berkshires, campgrounds and those sorts of things, where you have people just going up for the weekend, and garbage can become enormous issues in those places. The White Mountains in New Hampshire have similar issues to those. So not really any difference in bear behavior, but just the nature of kind of the human environment can change how what different issues manifest themselves in different places. For example, Florida is another place. They actually have a large amount of conflict with their black bears. And again, it's the vacation community, everyone going down, renting a house for a weekend, all the garbage goes out, and they have huge issues with garbage and vacationers down in Florida.
Thank you.
One last question came in, and then we will have to wrap up, folks. But David said, since you mentioned other wildlife, should you haze bobcats as well? We have 3 that are in our woods yard often.
Yeah, I mean, the risk associated with bobcats being around, hazing animals depends on your level of comfort with them. If I had bobcats around my house, I'd be thrilled. It's not an animal you get to see all that often in most circumstances. The risk from bobcats to people is really is non-existent. The only people that have ever been attacked by a bobcat are by rabid animals. And we've only ever recorded 5 of those instances in Massachusetts. So it's really not a common thing at all. Really don't even get reports of bobcat attacks on pets. So it's not really an issue there. So, enjoy it. If you have a reason that you don't want them around, certainly you can haze them off. They're going to respond. They tend to be a relatively shy animal, so they should respond to hazing very readily. So, going out, yelling at them, blowing an air horn, making loud noises, chasing them out of the yard certainly will be effective for a bobcat.
Great, thank you. Well, yeah, on behalf of everyone on the call, I just want to thank you so much for dedicating your time to educate us all tonight. That was a lot to handle, and we really appreciate it. And thank you, everyone. I think we ended up with about 130 folks on the call. So thank you for your interest. I'm going to pop up just a quick slide here and let you know that we will be sending a follow-up with the recording, some resources. We thought it might be good to summarize some of the tips you had for public safety, especially, and for keeping bears safe as well. And what else can I say? BNRC does have some upcoming free guided events related to beginner wildlife tracking. So feel free to check that information out on our website. And we hope to see you all again one way or another soon.
Nice chatting with you all tonight, and thank you all for coming, and thank you to BNRC for having me tonight. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.
It's great. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. That was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Had a lot of fun. Thank you.
All right, folks. Well, I will officially end the program now. Thank you all.